Today we're going to be looking at Unit 8, Notes Number 4, the Vietnam War Years. So this will go over the beginning part of the Vietnam War, and then 8.5 will wrap up how the war ends. French rule in Vietnam. From the late 1800s until World War II, France ruled most of Indochina, including Vietnam. French colonists encountered growing unrest among the Vietnamese peasants. They wanted to be independent. They didn't like the rule of the French. Ho Chi Minh founded the Indochinese Communist Party in 1930. In 1940, the Japanese took over Vietnam during their kind of aggression prior to the start of World War II. In 1941, Ho Chi Minh formed the Viet Minh, an organization whose goal was Vietnamese independence. So the Viet Minh did not want to be ruled by the Japanese or the French. They wanted the Vietnamese people to be independent and control their own government and country. France battles the Viet Minh. When the Allies defeated Japan in 1945, the Viet Minh believed their goal had been achieved, that they were rid of the French, they're rid of the Japanese. France, however, wanted their former colony back. In 1945, French troops returned to Vietnam. In 1950, the U.S. entered the struggle and supported France's claim. So Ho Chi Minh felt that the U.S. would support the Vietnamese cause for independence because it was similar to the U.S. in wanting independence from Great Britain. However, we are now in the Cold War, and since Ho Chi Minh wanted Vietnam to be communist, we could not support them in establishing a communist country. So, because of their government point of view, we supported the French. The United States steps in. President Eisenhower increased aid and support to the French, fearful of having another country fall to communism. He felt if one country became communist, their neighboring countries were more susceptible to also fall to communism, and this became known as the domino theory. Despite massive U.S. aid, the French could not retake Vietnam. In May of 1954, the Viet Minh overran the French outpost at Dien Bien Phu. The Geneva Accords temporarily divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel, very similar to when Korea was divided. So the communists under Ho Chi Minh controlled the north, the anti-communists supported by the U.S. controlled the south, and an election to unify the country was called for 1956. The Eisenhower and Kennedy administrations would provide economic and military aid to South Vietnam's non-communist regime. The Ho Chi Minh Trail. By 1956, the South Vietnamese president Ngo Dinh Diem refused to take part in the countrywide election. He was very unpopular in the South. He favored the Catholic population in the South over the Buddhist population. People felt that he promoted family members, people unqualified, so just felt that his whole administration was very, very corrupt, and so he did not get the support of the people. By 1957, a communist opposition group in the South, known as the Viet Cong, had begun attacks on Diem's government. Ho Chi Minh supported this group in 1959, began supplying arms to the Viet Cong along a network of paths known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So here we see Vietnam, and then we see the dividing line at the 17th parallel, North Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh's rule, communist, and then South Vietnam. So because there were people in the South, the Viet Cong, that did not support Diem, Ho Chi Minh supported them in terms of wanting to unite everyone under his control under a communist government. As fighters stepped up their attacks, South Vietnam grew more unstable. Under Kennedy, the U.S. supported a military coup that toppled Diem's regime that ended with Diem's assassination. So that was not what Kennedy wanted, but the U.S. could see that they were supporting someone that was unpopular with the Vietnamese people, and they could see kind of the growing opposition. And so they wanted to kind of get rid of him in power. So let's stop and think. Why did the U.S. initially get involved in the Vietnam conflict? And so this goes back to the Cold War. Normally, we probably wouldn't care who's in control, but because Ho Chi Minh wanted to establish Vietnam as a communist country, we felt we could not let that happen. We would support France. So we initially felt that if we can support France and France can regain control, that's what we want. stop the spread of communism. And then when France could not do that, we continued to step in to try to make it so that communism would not spread. President Johnson expands the conflict. President Johnson would be blamed for escalating the role of the U.S. in Vietnam. In 1964, an alleged attack on an American destroyer in the Gulf of Tonkin prompted Johnson to launch bombing strikes on North Vietnam. Congress would approve Johnson's request to extend military power in Vietnam with the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. In 1965, Johnson used his newly granted powers to unleash Operation Rolling Thunder, the first sustained bombing of North Vietnam. By June of 1965, more than 50,000 U.S. soldiers were battling the Viet Cong. Fighting in the jungle. The U.S. entered the war in Vietnam believing that its superior weaponry would lead to a victory over the Viet Cong, basically thinking it would be a quick war, we would defeat them very easily. However, the jungle terrain and the enemy's guerrilla tactics soon turned the war into a frustrating stalemate. The Viet Cong used hit and run and ambush tactics, and their knowledge of the jungle terrain was an advantage. The Viet Cong also had an elusive network of elaborate tunnels. So in this picture, we see the different tunnel system, and so this allowed for them to hide, to pop up, quickly attack the U.S. It allowed them to travel from village to village. They were very, very elaborate, and so it was an enemy that the U.S. made it very difficult for them to fight. And also because they weren't a kind of designated army, U.S. soldiers really had no idea who made up the Viet Cong. Are these just villagers? Are these, members of the Viet Cong? So it made it very difficult to identify the enemy and to fight against these very surprise attacks. The early war at home. The Johnson administration thought the war would end quickly. As it dragged on, support began to waver. As the number of troops in Vietnam continued to grow, so did the cost of the war. The nation's economy would suffer as a result. In 1967, President Johnson asked for a tax increase to help fund the war and keep inflation down. The cost of the Vietnam War was coming at the expense of funding the programs of the Great Society. Vietnam would become the first living room war as Americans would watch the nightly updates on the news. So they would get updated reports of what was happening. And again, first time ever that people were able to see the war happening live. By 1967, Americans were evenly split over supporting and opposing the war. The draft. Most soldiers who fought in Vietnam were called into combat under the country's Selective Service Act or draft. Men between the ages of 18 to 26 could be called into military service. Thousands of men tried to find ways to avoid the draft. Some joined the National Guard or Coast Guard or got a college deferment. With almost 80% of American soldiers coming from lower economic levels, Vietnam was seen as a working class war. African Americans in Vietnam. African Americans served in disproportionate numbers as ground combat troops. During the first few years of the war, they accounted for 20% of the combat deaths, despite representing only about 10% of the U.S. population. In 1967, Martin Luther King Jr. lashed out against what he called the cruel irony of American blacks dying for a country that still treated them as second-class citizens. Racial tensions also ran high within many platoons in Vietnam. The protest movement emerges. As the war continued, the protests grew and divided the country. Youths opposing the war felt that the conflict in Vietnam was basically a civil war and that the U.S. had no military business there. The anti-war movement grew beyond college campuses. A small number of returning veterans began to protest the war. By 1967, the anti-war movement had intensified with no signs of slowing down. Draft resistance continued until the early 1970s. The U.S. government accused more than 200,000 men of draft offenses and imprisoned nearly 4,000 draft dodgers. About 10,000 Americans fled, mainly to Canada, in order to avoid being drafted. So let's stop and think. How did the Vietnam War impact America? So, first thing is soldiers are being sent to fight. Many of them are dying for this war. that some people did not necessarily believe in its cause and, basically the prevention of communism. Many saw it as a Vietnam Civil War. We should not be there. It affected the economy, the cost of the war, having taxes raised. It affected American morale, being divided in terms of, do you support the war? Do you not support the war? So there were lots of tensions during the end of the 1960s. So in 8.5, we'll talk about how the war wraps up.